All right, let's jump right in. We're about to unpack a really fascinating legal puzzle, one that comes straight from the Talmud. You know, this incredible ancient text that's basically a giant record of generations of intense, logical debate? Think of it like a detective story, but for law and reason, and it's all centered on what seems like a simple question.
So what's the big question? It's this. What's the deal with the bones and tendons from a burnt offering? Are they supposed to go up in flames on the altar along with everything else? Are they just leftovers? As we're about to see, the answer is way more complicated than you'd think, and it opens up this amazing world of super detailed legal thinking.
So here's our game plan for cracking this case. We're going to start with the basic rule of thumb. Then we'll get to a critical distinction that really changes the game. We'll see how that new idea gets proven, but then bam, we hit a major contradiction. After we see how they brilliantly solve that, we'll wrap up with the final debate that's still on the table. Let's get into it.
Okay, so our whole journey here starts with what seems like a really simple rule from the Mishnah that's kind of the foundational text of Jewish oral law. But as you can probably guess, it's never that simple. One very clever question comes along and throws a huge twist into the mix.
The first rule seems pretty black and white. If the bones are still attached to the meat when it goes on the altar fire, well then they're part of the offering, they go up. But if they've already come apart from the flesh, they don't ascend the altar. Simple enough, right? Case closed? Not so fast.
And here is where the real puzzle starts. A sage, Rabbi Zera, asks this absolutely brilliant question. He says, hold on a second. What if the bones didn't fall off and land on the ground, away from the altar? What if they separated upward? Like they popped up, getting closer to the fire. Does that change the rules? Are they now kind of closer to being consumed? This one little what-if question is what kicks off this entire massive debate.
So into this debate steps another sage named Rabbah, and he has this total game-changing idea. He basically tells everyone they're focusing on the wrong thing. He says the key isn't where the bones fell, but when they fell. And that one shift in perspective changes the entire conversation.
Okay, before we go any further, we need to get this one term down cold, the sprinkling of the blood. In the ancient temple rituals, this was the moment. It was the action that officially consecrated the offering, made it holy, and gave the green light to put the flesh on the altar fire. You have to remember this, because literally everything we're about to discuss hinges on this one single act. So here is Rabbah's argument in a nutshell. It's all about the timing. If a bone breaks off from the flesh before that blood is sprinkled, it was never actually made holy. It's just a bone. It's ordinary property. In fact, the Talmud says you could literally take it and make knife handles from it. But if it separates after the blood is sprinkled, now its status is totally different. It was consecrated along with the flesh, but since it's now detached, it can't go on the altar anymore. So you see, the timing is absolutely everything.
Okay, so Rabbah has this really powerful theory. But in Talmudic law, you can't just have a good idea, you've got to prove it. And the proof here is really slick. It comes from a sophisticated legal tool, a textual analogy that connects two different types of offerings that you might not think are related.
So here's how they do it. They compare a guilt offering with our burnt offering. Now, with a guilt offering, the rules are clear. The priests eat the meat, and the bones are permitted for them to use. For the burnt offering, the status of the bones is, well, that's the big question mark, right? The key to solving this whole thing is a little phrase that shows up in the biblical verses for both of them. And this is the anchor for the entire argument, the phrase, "he shall have it." It pops up when the text is talking about both offerings. The sages use the shared language as a link to build an analogy. They argue that since the bones of a guilt offering are permitted for use, then it must be the same for the bones of a burnt offering that have separated from the flesh.
Now here's the part that makes the argument so powerful. In the verse about the burnt offering, that phrase, "he shall have it," is technically kind of extra. The point could have been made without it. And in Talmudic logic, when the text gives you an extra phrase like this and you use it to build an analogy, that analogy is considered rock solid, legally irrefutable.
So at this point, the case seems totally closed, right? Rabbah has laid out this clear theory based on timing, and he's backed it up with what's basically an irrefutable textual proof. The puzzle seems solved. But then, the plot thickens. A lot.
And we're feeling pretty good. We have a sense of resolution. Rabbah's logic is just so elegant, and his proof is solid. It really feels like we've got our final answer to the question of the ascending bones. But, you know, this is the Talmud. And the debate is never, ever that simple. Just when we think we've got it all figured out, another sage, Rav Ada bar Ahava, throws a wrench in the works. He brings up a new piece of evidence,
an ancient teaching called a baraita. Think of it as a source from that same early period that just wasn't included in the final cut of the Mishnah. And this teaching seems to completely contradict Rabbah's entire theory.
So this ancient teaching says that for a burnt offering, you are always on the hook for misusing its bones. This is a direct hit on Rabbah's theory. Remember, Rabbah said that if the bones separate before the blood is sprinkled, they become totally ordinary property. So now we've got a major problem, a clear conflict between two sources.
So what do they do now? Does Rabbah's whole theory get thrown out? Do they just ignore this ancient teaching? No, neither. Instead, we get to see this absolutely brilliant move of legal interpretation that solves the problem. They don't dismiss the evidence. They reread it with an incredible level of precision.
Let's walk through this because it's so clever. The Talmud proposes a simple rereading of that contradictory teaching. What if the word always doesn't mean what we think it means? What if that single statement is actually making two separate points? Point 1, if the bones separate before the blood is sprinkled, there is no liability. Point 2, if they separate after the blood is sprinkled, then you are always liable. With that one subtle adjustment, the contradiction just vanishes. In fact, the source that looked like it was going to destroy Rabbah's theory now becomes the perfect proof for it.
And so, the puzzle is solved. The contradiction is gone. Rabbah's theory is standing stronger than ever. But in the world of the Talmud, a clean, tidy resolution is often just the setup for another, even deeper layer of debate. This final comparison really gets to the core of the ongoing argument, because even with that elegant solution, not everybody is on the same page. Here we see Rabbah's final position right next to the opinion of another sage, Rabbi Elazar. And for Rabbi Elazar, those bones always have some level of holiness, it's just that the legal consequences change. It's a perfect example of how multiple, really sophisticated opinions can exist side by side in the Talmud.
So, you might be wondering, why spend so much time and brain power debating the legal status of a bone from a temple that's been gone for centuries? Well, because it was never really just about the bone. This whole intellectual journey is a masterclass in logic and textual analysis and in the absolute relentless pursuit of truth. It pushes us to ask these huge questions about how we even define something as holy, how that holiness can be transferred or even lost, and what it really takes to build a legal system that is both coherent and just. It's an incredible reminder that when you're pursuing truth, no detail is ever too small.